The wind off the San Francisco Bay didn't just blow, it cut. It was a cold, salt, heavy draft that found its way through the steel bars, through the concrete walls, and settled deep into the bones of the men inside. The year was 1954. The place was the United States Penitentiary, Alcatraz. They called it the Rock, a fortress designed to break the spirits of the most incorrigible men in the American penal system. It was a place of silence, a place of isolation, and a place where the rules of the outside world were replaced by a darker, more primal code. In this concrete tomb, there was a hierarchy etched in blood and fear. At the top were the bank robbers and the crime bosses, the men of respect. At the bottom were the lowest of the low, the men whose crimes turned the stomachs of even the hardest killers. And walking the yard, inmate number 1117, AZ, was a man who belonged to neither group, yet commanded the attention of them all. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. But the world knew him, feared him, and respected him as Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was not your average inmate. He was a chess master, a poet, a historian, and the undisputed godfather of Harlem. He had negotiated treaties with Lucky Luciano and waged guerrilla war against Dutch Schultz. But inside the walls of Alcatraz, titles meant nothing if you couldn't back them up with violence. The incident that would define his tenure on the Rock, the moment that would cement his legend among the worst criminals in America, began with a sound. Not a gunshot, not a scream, but the wet, disrespectful sound of spit hitting concrete. It happened in the common area, a space where the racial tensions of the 1950s were compressed into a powder keg waiting for a spark. A prisoner, a white man categorized in the prison files as a sex offender, a man whose jacket, his reputation and criminal history, marked him as the lowest caste in the prison ecosystem, made a mistake. Perhaps he thought the guards were watching too closely for retaliation. Perhaps he thought the racial hierarchy of the outside world, where a white man could disrespect a black man with impunity, would protect him here. He was wrong. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, the man who had ruled Harlem with an iron fist, and he spat on him. It was a ritualized insult. In the hyper-masculine, racially stratified environment of a federal supermax, spitting wasn't just an assault, it was an attempt to dismantle a man's entire existence. It was a challenge to his sovereignty. If Bumpy Johnson wiped that spit away and did nothing, he would cease to be the godfather. He would become prey. The air in the room shifted. Decades later, historians and sociologists would analyze this moment as a collision of prison politics and the architecture of retribution. But for Bumpy, in that split second, it wasn't sociology. It was mechanics. Johnson didn't shout. He didn't posture. Those who knew him, from the streets of Harlem to the cells of Dannemora, knew that Bumpy Johnson's most dangerous state was a sudden, eerie calm. He moved with the precision of the chess player he was known to be. He produced a shank, an improvised blade honed against concrete, until it was razor sharp. The attack was not a frenzied flailing of limbs. It was a calculated reassertion of order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. 7 times the blade entered the body of the man who had spat on him. The number 7 would later take on a mythological quality in the retelling, a symbol of complete and perfect retribution. But in the reality of Alcatraz, it was simply the necessary amount of force required to ensure the message was received, not just by the man bleeding on the floor, but by every other inmate watching from the periphery. The Riest prisoner, as he was identified in the hierarchy of the yard, had violated the cardinal rule of the underworld: respect the power structure. Bumpy Johnson, inmate 1117, AZ, stood over him. He had re-established the equilibrium. He had proven that even in chains, even on an island surrounded by freezing water, the king of Harlem was still a sovereign power. To understand why a man of Johnson's intellect and stature would risk additional years on his sentence for a moment of violence, we have to understand the world he inhabited. This wasn't just about anger. This was about survival. In the hard time era of Alcatraz, a prisoner's safety depended entirely on his jacket. Johnson was one of the few black organized crime figures on the Rock. He was a minority within a minority, surrounded by hostile white inmates and guards who viewed him with a mixture of contempt and fear. If he showed weakness, if he allowed a low-status inmate to degrade him publicly, the sharks would circle. The 7 stabs were a billboard. They announced that the architecture of retribution was still under Bumpy Johnson's control. But this violence, visceral and shocking as it was only one side of the coin. The man who wielded the shank was the same man who spent his days in solitary confinement reading history books, studying philosophy, and writing poetry. He was a man of contradictions, a social bandit, who could discuss the nuances of the French Revolution one moment and order a hit the next. To truly understand the incident on the Rock, we have to go back to the beginning, We have to leave the cold winds of San Francisco Bay and travel back to the humid, dangerous heat of Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. We have to trace the scars, both physical and psychological, that created the man they called Bumpy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on Halloween, October 31, 1905. He came into the world in Charleston, a city where the legacy of slavery was not history, but a living, breathing reality. The Jim Crow laws weren't just rules. They were the walls of a cage that trapped black families in cycles of poverty and terror. From the moment of his birth, Johnson was marked. He had a slight deformation of his skull, a prominent growth on the back of his head. It was this physical anomaly that earned him the nickname Bumpy. In a gentler world, it might have been a term of endearment. In the rough streets of the segregated South, it was a target. But the true deformation, the one that would shape his soul, was the systemic racial trauma that surrounded his family. The Johnsons were decent, hard-working people, but in South Carolina that offered no protection. When Bumpy was just 10 years old, his world fractured. His older brother, Willie, was accused of killing a white man. In 1915 Charleston, an accusation was a death sentence. The legal system was a farce, the true law was the lynch mob. Bumpy's parents, Margaret and William, knew that if Willie stayed, he would hang. They saw the rope in their nightmares. They mortgaged their tiny home, scraping together every penny they had, not to hire a lawyer, but to buy a train ticket. They sent Willie north, to live with relatives. This was Bumpy's first lesson in justice. He learned that the law did not protect people like him. He learned that survival often meant flight or fight. As he grew older, his parents watched him with growing dread. Bumpy wasn't like Willie. He didn't just want to survive, he refused to submit. He had a short temper and an insolence towards white people that was dangerous in the South. He wouldn't step off the sidewalk. He wouldn't lower his eyes. His parents, terrified that their second son would end up swinging from a tree, made a desperate decision. In 1919, they sent him away. They sent him to live with his older sister Mabel. They sent him to the place that was being whispered about in church pews and barber shops across the South as the Promised Land. They sent him to Harlem. Harlem in 1919 was a revelation. It was the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, a time of explosion in black art, culture, and politics. But for a teenager with a thick Southern accent, a small frame, and a bumpy head, it was another battlefield. Johnson arrived expecting a sanctuary, but he found a crucible. The local kids in Harlem were merciless. They mocked his speech, they mocked his clothes, and they mocked his head. He was an outsider in the one place he was supposed to belong. But the boy from Charleston had a fire in him that the city kids hadn't anticipated. He didn't retreat. He didn't cry. He fought. He fought with a ferocity that stunned his tormentors. He learned that while they might laugh at his accent, they couldn't laugh when they were bleeding. He became known as a scrappy fighter, a kid who wouldn't stay down, who used anything he could get his hands on. Pool cues, rocks, fists to win. He dropped out of high school, turning his back on the education his parents had hoped for, and enrolled in the school of the streets. He worked casual jobs, sweeping storefronts, hustling pool, selling newspapers. It was during this time, sweeping the sidewalk in front of a storefront, that he crossed paths with destiny. A local gangster named William "Bub" Hewlett controlled that territory. Bub was a man of respect, a tough operator in the local underworld. He noticed the small teenager who refused to back down from the older, tougher street kids. He saw the way Bumpy held himself, the way he didn't flinch. Bub Hewlett didn't see a delinquent. He saw potential. He saw a soldier. Hewlett took Johnson under his wing. He invited him into the business. And the business was protection. Specifically, offering physical protection to the high-profile numbers bankers of Harlem. The numbers game, or policy, was the lifeblood of the local economy. It was an illegal lottery, but in a community excluded from white banks and legitimate loans, the numbers bankers were the financial pillars of Harlem. To protect them, you needed men who were fearless. You needed men who could inflict violence without hesitation. You needed Bumpy Johnson. Under Hewlett's tutelage, Johnson's education was completed. He learned the geography of the underworld. He learned how to intimidate with a look, how to escalate force, and how to negotiate. But he was still a rough instrument. He was a street fighter, dangerous but unrefined. He drifted into armed robbery, extortion, and pimping. He spent his 20s in and out of reform schools and prisons, serving time on grand larceny charges. By 1932, he was an ex-con with a record. Released back onto the streets with no money and no prospects. It was a pivotal moment. He could have become just another statistic, another street tough ground down by the system. But Bumpy Johnson had something else. He had charisma. And he had a mind that was hungry for more than just survival. It was in 1932, fresh out of prison, that he met the woman who would polish the diamond. He met the Queen. Stephanie St. Clair was a legend. They called her Madame Queen, or the Queen of Policy. She was a Caribbean immigrant, fierce, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She ran one of the most successful numbers banks in Harlem. She was also a woman in a male-dominated criminal world, constantly fighting off rivals and corrupt police. When she met Bumpy Johnson, she didn't just see a bodyguard. She saw an intellectual equal. Despite the age difference, she was older, established, regal. They formed a bond that was immediate and potent. St. Clair recognized that Bumpy was more than muscle. He read, he thought. He strategized. She hired him as her principal lieutenant and enforcer, but he quickly became her confidant. Johnson studied her operation. He learned that the numbers racket wasn't just gambling. It was community banking. It provided jobs for runners, it provided hope for players, and the profits were often reinvested into local businesses. He began to see himself not as a criminal preying on his community, but as a protector of its economy. But there were wolves at the door. The end of Prohibition had dried up the revenue streams for the white mobsters downtown. They looked north to Harlem and saw the rivers of cash flowing through the numbers racket. They wanted it. Leading the charge was a man whose name became synonymous with brutality: Dutch Schultz. Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, was a Jewish mobster with a reputation for psychopathic violence. He looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine run by black women and what he considered inferior criminals. He issued an ultimatum: hand over the numbers racket or die. Most of the Harlem bankers, terrified of Schultz's machine guns and political connections, folded. They agreed to pay tribute, effectively becoming employees in their own businesses. But Stephanie St. Clair was not a woman who folded. She looked at Dutch Schultz and said no. And standing beside her, fingering the handle of a blade, was Bumpy Johnson. The war that followed would become the stuff of legend. It was David versus Goliath, Black Harlem versus the powerful white mob. But Johnson knew they couldn't win a conventional war. Schultz had more men, more guns, and the police in his pocket. So Bumpy Johnson didn't fight a conventional war. He fought a guerrilla war. Between 1932 and 1935, the streets of Harlem turned red. Johnson utilized his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. Harlem was a labyrinth of rooftops, alleyways, and basements that only locals knew. Johnson organized a crew of 9 hand-picked men. They were swift, silent, and deadly. He realized a simple tactical truth: Schultz's men stood out. They were white men in a black neighborhood. They couldn't blend in, they were targets. Johnson's tactics were ruthless. He orchestrated hit-and-run attacks, sniper fire from rooftops, kidnappings. Over 40 murders were attributed to this conflict. The bodies of Schultz's enforcers began to turn up in the Harlem River or in alleyways. Messages sent back to the Bronx that Harlem was not open for business. Johnson was everywhere and nowhere. He was a ghost. This was the era that solidified his reputation as the social bandit. To the people of Harlem, he wasn't a murderer, he was a defender. He was the man standing at the gate, holding back the invaders who wanted to strip the community of its wealth. He was Robin Hood with a switchblade. But while Johnson was fighting the war on the streets, the politics of the mafia were shifting. The Italian mob, led by the visionary Charles Lucky Luciano, was watching. Luciano was modernizing the mafia, creating the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. He viewed Dutch Schultz as a dinosaur, too violent, too unpredictable, too loud. Schultz's war in Harlem was bringing too much heat, too much police attention. The tipping point came when Schultz, enraged by the investigations of Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, proposed assassinating a federal official. The commission decided Schultz was a liability. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in the bathroom of the Palace Chophouse in Newark, New Jersey. The beast was dead, the war was over, but the peace had to be won. With St. Clair looking to retire from the life, she had made her point and survived. The mantle of leadership fell to Bumpy. He knew he couldn't fight the entire Italian mafia forever. He needed a treaty. He arranged a meeting with Lucky Luciano. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano is one of the most pivotal moments in the history of American organized crime. It wasn't a meeting of subordinate and boss, it was a meeting of two sovereigns. They met not in a back alley, but often at the YMCA on the 135th Street, and they didn't just talk business, they played chess. The image is striking: the Italian Godfather and the Harlem Godfather, sitting over a chessboard, moving pieces, analyzing strategies. It was a recognition of mutual intellect. Johnson negotiated a peace with honor. The deal was simple but revolutionary. The Harlem numbers bankers would remain independent. They would run their own games in their own neighborhood. However, they would pay a tribute, lay-off, fee to the Italians, who would in turn provide police protection and cover big bets that the local bankers couldn't handle. It was an imperfect solution. Some saw it as a capitulation, but Johnson saw it as survival. He had preserved the autonomy of Harlem's criminal class against the most powerful crime syndicate in the world. He had forced the mafia to treat a black man as a partner, not a servant. As his wife Mamie later wrote, the people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses. And they realized that for the first time a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down. With the peace established, Bumpy Johnson ascended to the throne. He was the undisputed king. If you wanted to open a numbers spot, you saw Bumpy. If you wanted to convert a brownstone into a speakeasy, you saw Bumpy. He walked the streets like royalty, dressed in the finest suits, rubbing elbows with celebrities like Lena Horne and Billie Holiday. He was a patron of the arts, a published poet, and a philanthropist who gave out turkeys on Thanksgiving and coal in the winter. But beneath the velvet glove was a hand of steel. The peace with the Italians didn't mean the violence stopped. It just meant it was internal. Johnson enforced discipline with a terrifying efficiency. And nothing illustrates the duality of Bumpy Johnson, the gentleman and the monster, better than the incident with Ulysses Rawlins. Rawlins was a rival, a man who thought he could challenge Johnson's dominance. It was a miscalculation. The confrontation took place in a crowded dinner club, the kind of place where people went to be seen, to eat good food, to listen to jazz. Johnson spotted Rawlins across the room. There was no hesitation. No words exchanged. Johnson pulled a switchblade. The violence was intimate and grotesque. Johnson pounced on Rawlins. The blade flashed. He didn't just stab him, he carved him. By the time Johnson stepped back, Rawlins was on the floor, his face a ruin. One of his eyeballs was hanging from its socket, suspended by the optic nerve. The room was silent, frozen in horror. And then, Bumpy Johnson did the thing that would be whispered about for decades. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He straightened his tie. He smoothed his suit jacket. He stepped over the mutilated man, picked up a menu, and calmly told the waiter that he had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. It was a performance. It was theater of the Macbeth. By sitting down and eating a meal moments after gouging a man's eye out, Johnson was sending a message that was louder than any scream. He was saying that violence was as natural to him as breathing. He was saying that he was untouchable. He was saying that he was the master of his environment, whether that environment was a dinner club or a war zone. This was the reputation that preceded him to prison. This was the jacket he wore. The man who ate spaghetti next to a dangling eyeball. But even legends have enemies, and the biggest enemy of all was the United States government. By the early 1950s, the game was changing. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, led by the zealous Harry Anslinger, was launching a crusade against the drug trade. Heroin was beginning to flood into American cities, and the authorities needed a head on a pike. They wanted a big fish. Bumpy Johnson was the biggest fish in Harlem. In 1952, Johnson was indicted on charges of conspiracy to sell heroin. He claimed until his dying day that it was a frame-up. He argued that while he took cuts from everything in Harlem, he was not a drug dealer, that he had tried to keep the hard stuff out. Whether he was guilty or not, the verdict was preordained. An all-white jury convicted him. The judge sentenced him to 15 years. 15 years. For a man of 47, it was a lifetime. He was sent first to Dannemora and then, because he was deemed too influential, too powerful to be kept in a regular population, he was transferred to the end of the line, Alcatraz. And so we returned to the rock. We returned to the cold wind and the spitting prisoner. When that man spat on Bumpy Johnson, he didn't just spit on a prisoner. He spat on the man who had survived the Jim Crow South. He spat on the man who had fought Dutch Schultz to a standstill. He spat on the man who had gouged out an eye and ordered dinner. The 7 stabs were not just retaliation. They were history repeating itself. They were the scrappy fighter, from Charleston refusing to be bullied. They were the social bandit, enforcing the code. Johnson spent years in segregation for that attack. He spent years in the dark with nothing but his mind. But Bumpy Johnson's mind was a fortress. While other men went mad in the silence of Alcatraz, Johnson thrived. He turned his cell into a university. He read history, philosophy, law. He memorized poetry. He played chess against himself, visualizing the board on the ceiling. He became a reference point for other inmates. They didn't just come to him for protection, they came to him for knowledge. He was the professor of the penitentiary. There is a persistent story, one that hovers between myth and history, about the most famous event in the history of Alcatraz, the 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. The only successful escape from the inescapable prison. The official story is that they drowned. But in the underworld, and among the old-timers in Harlem, a different story is told. They say that an escape like that, involving rafts made of raincoats and a navigation of the treacherous bay currents, couldn't happen without help from the outside. They say that Bumpy Johnson, the man with the connections, the man who had negotiated with Luciano, arranged it. They say he used his influence to have a boat waiting at Pier 13 in the Hunters Point district. They say he delivered the escapees to freedom. Why didn't he go with them? His wife Mamie had a theory. She said Bumpy Johnson was too proud to be a fugitive. He wanted to walk out of the front gate, not sneak out the back. He wanted to be a free man, not a hunted one. He would serve his time, he would pay his debt, and he would return to Harlem as a king, and he did. In 1963, Bumpy Johnson was released. He walked off the ferry and back into the world. When he returned to Harlem, he was greeted with a parade. The neighborhood came out to welcome him. The Godfather was home, but the Harlem of 1963 was not the Harlem of 1952. The world had shifted on its axis. The streets were different. The heroin that he had been accused of selling had taken root. The peace with honor had frayed. The Italian mob, now dealing heavily in narcotics, had flooded the neighborhood with dope. The community banking system of the numbers racket was being replaced by the predatory economy of addiction. The social bandit was returning to a society that was eating itself alive. And there were new voices in the street. Voices of revolution, voices of anger. The civil rights movement was in full swing. And the loudest, most electrifying voice belonged to a man Bumpy Johnson had known years ago, a former street hustler named Detroit Red. But the world now knew him as Malcolm X. The relationship between the old gangster and the new revolutionary is one of the great tragic friendships of the era. They were two sides of the same coin. Both men were products of racial trauma. Both men were brilliant, charismatic leaders who refused to bow to white authority. Malcolm X respected Bumpy. He saw him as a man who had stood up when others sat down. Bumpy respected Malcolm. He saw him as the evolution of the struggle, a man fighting with words instead of switchblades. When Malcolm X split from the Nation of Islam in 1964, he became a marked man. The nation, his former family, wanted him dead. The police wanted him gone. He was alone. So, he turned to the one man who understood violence better than anyone. He turned to Bumpy Johnson. For a time, the unthinkable happened. The leader of the black nationalist movement was protected by the guards of the Harlem underworld. Johnson's men stood watch over Malcolm. They were professionals, experienced in the guerrilla warfare of the Schultz era. As long as Bumpy's men were there, Malcolm was safe. But politics is a complicated game. Malcolm X realized that his association with a known crime boss was damaging his credibility. He was trying to build a global movement, trying to work with mainstream civil rights leaders. He couldn't be seen with the Godfather. He asked Bumpy to stand down. He asked him to withdraw the guards. Bumpy argued he knew the streets. He knew that without protection, Malcolm was a walking target. But he respected his friend's wishes. He pulled his men back. 2 weeks later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was gunned down in the Audubon Ballroom. Bumpy was devastated. He felt the weight of the loss. He felt the failure of the system to protect a man who was trying to save it. And perhaps, he felt a renewed anger at the police who had watched Malcolm die, just as they had watched Harlem suffer for decades. In December 1965, Johnson channeled that anger into a final act of defiance that was purely political. The police were harassing him, conducting relentless surveillance of his movements and the neighborhood. It was a siege. So, Bumpy Johnson did something that Dutch Schultz never would have understood. He staged a sit-down strike. He walked into the 28th Precinct police station and sat down. He refused to leave. He turned the tables on the law. He demanded to be arrested. He forced them to charge him with refusal to leave a police station. It was a farce, and he knew it. When the case went to court, the judge had no choice but to acquit him. It was a victory. It was the old chess master making one final move, using the legal system against itself, proving that he was still the smartest man in the room. But time remains the one opponent that cannot be defeated. Bumpy Johnson was getting older. His heart, strained by years of prison, years of war, and the weight of a crumbling kingdom, was failing. The end came not with a bang but with a meal. July 7, 1968. The Wells Restaurant in Harlem. It was late, the early hours of the morning. Bumpy was there with his friend Junie Bird. He was eating soul food, chicken and hominy grits. He was surrounded by the people of his neighborhood. He clutched his chest. The pain was sudden and absolute. He fell over. He died in the arms of his friend. He was 62 years old. When news of his death spread, Harlem stopped. Thousands of people attended his funeral. The police lined the rooftops with shotguns, fearing that even in death, Bumpy Johnson might command a riot. But there was no riot. There was only mourning. They buried him in Woodlawn Cemetery. With him, an era was buried. The age of the gentleman gangster, the social bandit, who funded the community while skimming from the top, was over. The vacuum he left would be filled by men like Frank Lucas, men who viewed the drug trade not as a necessary evil to be managed, but as a path to unlimited wealth, regardless of the cost to the community. But the story of Bumpy Johnson endures. It endures because it is complex. He was a criminal, yes. He was a killer, yes. He stabbed a man 7 times for spitting on him. He gouged out a man's eye for disrespect. But he was also a product of a specific time and place. He was the answer to a question asked by a racist society. What happens when you back a brilliant, proud man into a corner and deny him every legitimate path to power? You get the Godfather. You get the man who builds his own law. You get the man who, when the world spits on him, straightens his tie, picks up a knife, and demands respect. To understand the blade that flashed in Alcatraz, to understand the mind that could turn a prison yard into a chessboard, we have to look at the fire that forged him. We left Ellsworth Raymond Johnson on the streets of Harlem in the early 1920s, a teenager with a bumpy head and a southern accent, fighting for every inch of respect he could get. He had arrived in the Black Mecca, seeking safety, but he found a hierarchy as rigid as the one he had left in Charleston. In Harlem, you were either predator or prey, and Bumpy Johnson had decided early on that he would never be prey again. He dropped out of high school, turning his back on the formal education his parents had sacrificed for. But this didn't mean he stopped learning. The streets became his classroom. He worked casual jobs to survive, hustling pool, selling newspapers, and sweeping storefronts. It was a humble beginning, but it placed him in the orbit of the men who ran the neighborhood. It was while sweeping these storefronts that he caught the eye of William Bub Hewlett. Bub Hewlett was a gangster of the old school, a man who commanded respect through physical presence and fear. He watched the young Johnson. He saw how the boy handled himself when the local toughs tried to push him off the sidewalk. He saw that Bumpy didn't run to the police and didn't back down, even when outnumbered. Hewlett saw a scrappy fighter, a kid with a short temper but a steely resolve. When Johnson refused to back off of Hewlett's storefront territory during a dispute, Hewlett didn't crush him, he recruited him. Hewlett brought Johnson into the fold, introducing him to the mechanics of the Harlem underworld. The business was protection. The high-rolling numbers bankers, the men and women who ran the illegal lotteries that served as the community's financial lifeblood, needed security. They carried large amounts of cash and operated outside the law, making them prime targets for robbery. Hewlett offered them physical protection, and Bumpy became one of his most capable soldiers. This period was Johnson's apprenticeship. He learned the geography of power. He learned that violence, when applied correctly, was a business tool. He graduated from sweeping floors to armed robbery, extortion, and pimping. He was building a resume of brutality. But he was also building a rap sheet. His extracurricular activities led to multiple arrests, and he spent much of his 20s revolving through the doors of reform schools and prisons. By the time he was 30, he had spent nearly half his life behind bars. When he was released from prison in 1932, the Great Depression was in full swing. Johnson stepped back onto the pavement of Harlem with empty pockets and no legitimate prospects. To the outside world, he was just another ex-convict, a statistic of the penal system. But Bumpy Johnson possessed a dangerous combination of traits. He had the muscle of a street enforcer and the mind of a scholar. He was looking for an opportunity, and he found it in the form of a woman who was defying the most powerful criminals in America. He found Stephanie St. Clair. They called her Madam Queen, or the Queen of Policy. St. Clair was a force of nature, a Caribbean immigrant who had built one of the most successful numbers banks in Harlem. She was wealthy, flamboyant, and fiercely independent. She was a woman operating in a male-dominated criminal ecosystem, and she held her ground with a ferocity that demanded respect. When she met Bumpy Johnson, she didn't just see a thug. She saw an equal. Despite the age difference, St. Clair was older. Established, they formed a partnership that would become legendary. Some biographers suggest she was 10 years his senior, others 20, but the dynamic was clear. She was the strategist, the queen on the board, and he was her knight. St. Clair was impressed by Johnson's intelligence. He wasn't just a brute. He could read, he could calculate, and he could plan. She hired him as her personal bodyguard and chief enforcer. The timing was critical. The end of Prohibition in 1933 had been a disaster for the white mobs downtown. The revenue from bootleg liquor dried up overnight. The Italian and Jewish syndicates, desperate for new income streams, looked north to Harlem. They saw the numbers racket, a game where residents bet pennies and nickels on a 3-digit number, and they saw millions of dollars in untaxed profit. They decided it was time to take over. Leading this invasion was Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was the beer baron of the Bronx, a man known for his erratic behavior and extreme violence. He issued an ultimatum to the Harlem bankers: hand over your operations, pay tribute, or die. Many of the black bankers, terrified of Schultz's machine guns and political connections, capitulated. They surrendered their independence and became mere employees in their own businesses. But Stephanie St. Clair refused. She was not a woman who bowed to intimidation. She decided to fight, and in Bumpy Johnson, she had the weapon she needed to wage a war that the white mob never expected. The conflict that followed, known as the Numbers War, was a brutal chapter in New York's criminal history. It was a mismatch on paper. Schultz had an army of killers, corrupt police on his payroll, and the resources of a major syndicate. St. Clair and Johnson had a small crew and the home field advantage. But Johnson knew that in asymmetric warfare, the smaller force wins by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless. Johnson organized a crew of 9 trusted men. He didn't try to meet Schultz's forces in open combat. Instead, he waged a guerrilla war. He understood the terrain of Harlem, the alleyways, the rooftops, the basements, in a way the invaders from the Bronx never could. He also exploited a simple visual reality: Schultz's men were white. In the segregated streets of 1930s Harlem, a white man loitering on a corner stood out. He was a target. Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's wife, later described the tactics in her biography. Picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. Johnson's crew struck with terrifying precision. They utilized hit-and-run tactics, sniper fire from rooftops, and kidnappings. The violence was escalating. The streets were becoming a slaughterhouse. Over the course of the conflict, more than 40 murders were attributed to the war between St. Clair and Schultz. Bodies were found in the Harlem River. Men disappeared into the trunks of cars and were never seen again. Johnson was the architect of this bloodshed. He was the social bandit, a figure who walked the line between criminal and protector. To the residents of Harlem, he was defending the community's economic independence against a foreign invader. He was a violent man, yes, but he was their violent man. But Johnson was also a realist. He knew that they couldn't kill their way to a permanent victory. Schultz was relentless, and his resources were vast. St. Clair was eventually arrested and imprisoned, removing the queen from the board. The pressure was mounting. However, the dynamics of organized crime were shifting above their heads. The Italian mafia, under the visionary leadership of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, was watching the chaos in Harlem with growing distaste. Luciano was in the process of modernizing the American mob. He created the Commission, a governing body designed to resolve disputes and maximize profits without unnecessary bloodshed. He viewed Dutch Schultz as a dinosaur, a chaotic, violent relic of the Prohibition era who was bringing too much hit on the entire underworld. The tipping point came when Schultz, enraged by the relentless pursuit of Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, proposed assassinating a federal official. The commission decided that Schultz was a liability. He had to go. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in the restroom of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. The invasion was decapitated. With Schultz dead, the war was effectively over. But the question of Harlem's future remained. Would the Italians simply step in and crush what remained of St. Clair's organization? This is where Bumpy Johnson's genius truly shined. He didn't wait to be conquered. He reached out to Lucky Luciano. The negotiations between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano are a testament to Johnson's diplomatic skill. They were two kings from different worlds. Luciano was the most powerful criminal in the country. Johnson was the undisputed lord of Harlem. They met reportedly not with guns drawn but over a chessboard. Johnson secured a deal that was unprecedented. He negotiated a peace with honor. The terms were pragmatic. The Harlem Numbers bankers would retain their independence. They would run their own games, employ their own runners, and keep their autonomy. In exchange, they would pay a tribute to the Genovese crime family, a cut of the profits. This layoff money ensured that if a banker was hit with a massive payout that could bankrupt them, the Italian mob would cover the bet. It also bought police protection and, crucially, peace. It wasn't a perfect victory. Some saw it as paying rent to the white mob. But as Mamie Johnson wrote, The people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses. And they realized that for the first time a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down. Johnson had preserved the infrastructure of Harlem's underground economy. He had saved the jobs of thousands of runners and clerks. He had forced the mafia to treat him as a partner, not a servant. With the treaty signed, Bumpy Johnson ascended to the peak of his power. St. Clair, having survived the war and served her time, largely retired from the rackets. Handing the reins of the organization over to Johnson, he was now the godfather. For the next 15 years, Bumpy Johnson was Harlem. He ran the neighborhood with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He was a complex figure, a study in contradictions. On one hand, he was a ruthless crime boss. If you wanted to open a numbers spot on the avenue, you saw Bumpy. If you wanted to run a speakeasy, you checked with Bumpy first. If you didn't, the consequences were severe. The incident with Ulysses Rawlins serves as the definitive example of Johnson's enforcement style during this golden era. Rawlins was a rival who made the mistake of challenging the king. The confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened in a dinner club, in front of witnesses. Johnson spotted Rawlins and didn't hesitate. He pounced, a switchblade appearing in his hand as if by magic. The violence was intimate and terrifying. Johnson slashed Rawlins repeatedly. In the scuffle, he gouged Rawlins' face, leaving one of his eyeballs hanging from its socket by the ligaments. It was a gruesome, stomach-turning display of dominance. But what happened next is what built the legend. Bumpy didn't flee. He didn't panic. He stood up, adjusted his suit, straightened his tie, and stepped over the maimed man. He picked up a menu and calmly told the staff that he had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. This story circulated through Harlem like electricity. It sent a clear message: Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. He was a man who could inflict horror and then eat dinner. It was this reputation, this jacket, that kept the peace. It was the architecture of retribution. But there was another side to the man, the social bandit. Narrative wasn't just propaganda, it was rooted in his actions. Johnson was known to give freely to the poor. He delivered turkeys on Thanksgiving, handed out coal in the winter, and paid rent for families facing eviction. He was a Robin Hood figure, redistributing a portion of the illicit wealth back into the community that generated it. He was also a man of culture. He was a regular at the high society spots of the Harlem Renaissance, rubbing elbows with celebrities like Billie Holiday, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Lena Horne. He was a published poet, his work appearing in Harlem magazines. He dressed impeccably, carried himself with the dignity of a businessman, and lectured young men on the importance of education. Ironic, perhaps, given his own dropout status, but sincere. Frank Lucas, who would later claim to be Johnson's protege, described him as refined and classy, more like a businessman with a legitimate career than most people in the underworld. Yet, the golden age could not last. The world was changing. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, was intensifying its war on drugs, while Johnson had built his empire on gambling, a vice considered relatively harmless by the community. Heroin was beginning to seep into the veins of the city. The authorities needed a target. They needed the biggest target they could find. In 1952, the hammer fell. Bumpy Johnson was indicted on charges of conspiracy to sell heroin. The trial was a sensation. Johnson vehemently denied the charges, claiming he was a victim of a frame-up, a convenient scapegoat for a federal agency desperate for headlines. He argued that while he took a cut from all business in Harlem, he was not a drug trafficker. Whether he was innocent or guilty of the specific charge, the outcome was determined by his reputation. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. 15 years. For a man approaching 50, it was a potential death sentence. He was stripped of his freedom, stripped of his empire, and sent into the federal penal system. He was transferred to the most notorious prison in America, Alcatraz. And this brings us back to the cold winds of the San Francisco Bay. Back to the spitting incident. When Johnson walked onto the rock, he was no longer the king of Harlem who could order spaghetti over a fallen rival. He was inmate file Wellington's in AZ. He was just another number in a fortress designed to crush egos. But Bumpy Johnson refused to be crushed. The stabbing of the inmate who spat on him was not a random act. It was the Godfather, responding to a challenge in the only language the prison understood. It was the scrappy fighter from Charleston resurfacing. It was the guerrilla general of the numbers war protecting his territory, even if that territory was just the space around his own body. The years in Alcatraz were hard, but they were also a period of intense intellectual activity for Johnson. While locked away, he didn't rot. He studied history and philosophy. He played chess, visualizing the moves in his head when he didn't have a board. He became a mentor to younger inmates, teaching them that the mind was a weapon sharper than any shank. He earned the respect of the population not just through fear, but through wisdom. There are whispers, persistent and detailed, that his reach extended beyond the walls even then. The 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the only men to ever vanish from the Rock, has a Bumpy Johnson connection in the folklore of the underworld. Unconfirmed reports and urban legends suggest that Johnson used his connections to arrange for a boat to pick the escapees up from the bay. The story goes that the boat dropped them off at Pier 13 in the Hunters Point district of San Francisco. Why would he help them? Perhaps it was a final thumb in the eye of the system that had caged him. Perhaps it was simply business. Or perhaps, as his wife Mamie suggested, it was because he admired their audacity, even if he wouldn't join them. She claimed Bumpy wanted to walk out the front gate as a free man, not sneak out the back as a fugitive. And in 1963 he did just that. He survived the Rock, he survived the isolation, he survived the 7 stabs and the consequences. He was released on parole and returned to New York. The homecoming was surreal. When word spread that Bumpy was back, an impromptu parade formed in the streets of Harlem. People cheered. The king had returned from exile. For a brief moment, it seemed like the old days were back. But the Harlem of 1963 was not the Harlem of 1952. The heroin epidemic that Johnson had been accused of fueling had now fully taken hold, devastating the community. The streets were meaner, more desperate. The social contract of the numbers racket was being replaced by the predatory chaos of the drug trade. The Italian mob, his old partners, were now flooding the neighborhood with narcotics, bypassing the old agreements. And there was a new energy in the air, a political fire. The civil rights movement was challenging the very foundations of American society. And at the center of this storm was a man Bumpy had known years ago, a man who had once been a street hustler named Detroit Red. Now, the world knew him as Malcolm X. The friendship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X is one of the most fascinating chapters of the 1960s. They were two icons of black power, operating in different spheres but sharing a mutual respect. They had known each other since the 1940s. When Malcolm split from the Nation of Islam in 1964, he found himself isolated and in danger. The nation branded him a traitor. His life was threatened. Malcolm, the righteous leader, turned to Bumpy, the criminal boss, for help. It was a pragmatic alliance. Johnson provided protection. He sent his guerrilla warriors to stand guard over Malcolm. For a time, the underworld shielded the prophet. Bumpy's men were professionals. As long as they were on watch, Malcolm was safe. But the political optics were impossible. Malcolm X was trying to build a legitimate movement, trying to work with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. He couldn't be seen surrounded by mob enforcers. He made the difficult decision to ask Bumpy to stand down. Johnson argued against it. He knew the danger better than anyone, but he respected Malcolm's autonomy. He withdrew his men. 2 weeks later, Malcolm X was assassinated. The death of Malcolm X hit Johnson hard. It was a reminder that the system, whether legal or criminal, was merciless. It perhaps fueled the final act of political theater in Johnson's life. In December 1965, tired of the relentless police surveillance that dogged his every step, Bumpy staged a protest. But he didn't riot. He didn't shoot. He staged a sit-down strike. He walked into a police station in Harlem and refused to leave. He forced the police to arrest him for refusal to leave a police station. It was a calculated move, a chess master's gambit. He used the tactics of the civil rights demonstrators to highlight the harassment he was facing. He was acquitted by a judge, scoring a legal and public relations victory against the NYPD. Even in his 60s, Bumpy Johnson was still outsmarting the opposition. But time is the one opponent that cannot be checkmated. The years of prison, the stress of the life, the smoking, and the burden of command took their toll. Johnson's heart was failing. The end came on July 7, 1968. It wasn't a hail of bullets. It wasn't a shiv in the yard. It was a quiet collapse in a place he loved. Bumpy was at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, a favorite spot. He was eating a meal of chicken legs and hominy grits. It was just before 2 a.m. He was surrounded by friends. He clutched his chest and fell over. He died in the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird. The godfather of Harlem was dead at the age of 62. His death marked the end of an era. The gentleman gangster was gone. The transition to the new breed of criminal, men like Frank Lucas, who prioritized profit over community standing, was immediate. Lucas would later claim to have been with Bumpy when he died, but Johnson's widow, Mamie, fiercely denied this, stating Lucas wasn't even in the circle at the time. She wanted the history to be accurate. Bumpy died with his friends, not his successors. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson left behind a legacy that is as complicated as the city he ruled. He was a violent criminal who ordered murders and ruined lives. He was a community benefactor who paid rents and funded education. He was a convict who stabbed a man 7 times for spitting on him, and a philosopher who read history in solitary confinement. He was the product of a racist system that denied him a legitimate path to power, so he carved one out of the shadows. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's life forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, power, and survival. When the law fails to protect you, do you become your own law? And once you cross that line, can you ever really come back? From the streets of Charleston to the cells of Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson never bowed. He never looked down. And when the world spat on him, he made sure the world bled. This has been the story of the godfather of Harlem, the man who played chess with Lucky Luciano and stood guard for Malcolm X. The man who taught Alcatraz the meaning of respect. If you found this deep dive into criminal history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We dig up the stories that the history books often overlook. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And let us know in the comments, was Bumpy Johnson a hero to his community, a villain, or something in between? Thanks for watching.